Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm so excited to be here with Frances Farr. She has written a wonderful story called In Borrowed Houses. This is an absolutely beautiful memoir of 7 years of her time in Lebanon. Frances spent about 30 years of her life living in the Middle East in both Lebanon and Jordan. And In Borrowed Houses is the story of her life and her husband's life when they lived in a house that they renovated together between about 1980 and 1987. Is that correct? That's about the time in that house. So that was right in the middle of the Lebanese Civil War. So it's a tale of love for the country and the people of Lebanon when it was facing deep and terrifying challenges. Foundation, when we talk about mimetic theory and we talk about Rene Girard, we want to emphasize our interconnectedness as people. We want to emphasize our interdivisiduality, that we are made up of the relationships that form our lives. And Frances has described the relationships with the people and the country of Lebanon so beautifully in her book. I feel like all our talking is really just to encourage people to live the kind of life that Frances is living and that she lived in Lebanon. So that's why I am so honored and excited to welcome her. So welcome, Frances. It's so wonderful for you to be with us.
Thank you, Lindsay. I'm happy.
I want to just begin by having you tell a little bit of your story, how you became involved in mission work in the Middle East, particularly in Lebanon. So why don't you go ahead and just begin with your story?
Well, Lindsay, when Wayne and I were growing up, he in churches in Minnesota and I in Arkansas, the churches really challenged young people in those days to serve overseas because they believed in missions and they believed in incarnational missions. So they challenged us to do something that they didn't promise it would be easy. They thought it was hard, but they wanted people who really loved Jesus, who would volunteer, that they would go to some part of the world where there were fewer workers and they were more needed. And so both of us felt we wanted to express our love for Jesus. We wanted to be the best disciples we could possibly be. And that was a challenge that we accepted, to go to some other country and work. And so when it came right down to doing it, then they wanted to know, well, where would you like to go? And it happened that we were living in Berkeley, our seminary. We went to Golden Gate Seminary in Berkeley, California, and it was an international city. There were people from all over the world in Berkeley, right down the street from the school. And also there were many international students at the University of California, which was just like a mile up the street from us. And we used to go at least one night a week and meet international students and invite them to events that we had. And doing that, we met people from all over the world. And so when we needed to decide, well, where would you like to go? We said, well, who do we really like? And with whom do we have good rapport? And it was the Arabs. And it was a little bit strange to believe, but it was the honest truth. And they were the kind of people that we we felt an honesty in the relationship, because if one of them didn't like us, we knew it. If they did like us, we knew it. Um, they were upfront, honest about their feelings, and they were warm and relate to people, and we loved that. And so we chose to go to the Middle East. And it turned out that Jordan was where my husband was needed. That's where the Southern Baptist Foreign Mission Board wanted to send us, because they needed a director for a little school. And Wayne was qualified to do that. And so we went to Jordan. But first we studied Arabic at Georgetown University. And by the way, by this time we had 5 children. So we were taking 5 children with us to the Middle East. And, you know, truthfully, we probably didn't know exactly what we were doing. The way most of us, you know, we have to make all the important decisions in life before we're old enough and wise enough to make them. But we learn as we go. And so anyway, we studied Arabic, and we had we really wanted to go to Lebanon, and I can't even now remember exactly why we thought we wanted to go to Lebanon. But when the mission board said, we really need you in Jordan, we said, that's fine. We'll be happy to go to Jordan. So we did go to Jordan, but after a year of Arabic study at Georgetown University, and then going to Lebanon for 1 year for our second year of Arabic study, because it takes a long time to learn to function in the Arabic language. So we studied colloquial Arabic at Georgetown, and then we went to Lebanon. We were able to communicate, and that was a wonderful feeling. That was a good thing they did for us, letting us study before we went. But then we couldn't read and write. So in the next year in Lebanon, we learned to read and write. And then we went to Jordan, and we had many experiences in Jordan before events came together and caused us to transfer to Lebanon.
And you had 5 kids at that point. Did they pick up the language quickly too? I mean, at that age, when you're younger, it's easier. So
it was way easier for them than for us. One of the amazing things we discovered was that children will find a way to communicate. And our children became friends with other children whose language they couldn't even speak, you know, and they would spend hours playing together with very few words, you know. We didn't quite understand how they did that, but the children were actually a great asset to us in the Arab world.
I imagine so, yeah. The brains just absorbed so much, so I imagine they must have been very helpful. How old were they? I'm just wondering, like, how old were? What was the range between them?
Our youngest was just 2, and our eldest was not quite 10.
Okay.
They were close together in age, and of course, the very youngest one was the one who learned Arabic the most easily. She just absorbed it, you know.
But you just picked up your whole life and just moved across the world. What were some of the biggest surprises, both positive and negative, about living in another country?
You know, I think that it was easier than we thought it would be in some ways. For instance, I imagined very poor housing. I thought I'll live in an Arab village and I will need to live just the way that Arabs do, you know. And I was prepared that my main work would be, you know, sitting on the floor with Arab women, sharing their lives and sharing myself and my faith with them. And in fact, we had a much better house than I ever imagined that we would. And the other thing is I was prepared for the people around me not to feel good about having missionaries. I thought there would be some hostility, but in fact, we found that there's so much appreciation for religion in the Middle East that, I mean, my husband's ID card said that he was a man of God.
Mm.
And a man of God was a real valuable person to everybody. It was a nice thing to be called a man of God on your ID card. And then I was the man of God's wife. So that was good, you know, and the people around us were so friendly when we would move to the village in Jordan.
Mm-hmm.
I remember that we were unpacking, and a woman came walking up the path to our house, basket on her head, a woman in a long black dress and a scarf, and in the basket was a basket of figs, a gift for the new neighbors, for the new missionaries. She knew that we were missionaries. And so this was wonderful. I think a negative surprise, it had not crossed my mind that how our ministry and how our relationships would be impacted by politics. That was not fun to discover that a lot of people disliked my government and were even angry at America. And they were blunt and frank about it, though actually they mostly felt the way the young Jordanian told me. He was a university student. He said, I hate your government. I hated that you did this. I hated that you did that. But I never met an American I didn't like.
Right. Yeah,
So,
they really distinguished between the people and the policies of our government.
yes.
Yeah.
They did do that, and that was very good. But I did feel that that our message was somehow compromised a lot of times because somehow America stood for Christianity to a lot of people.
Yes. Yes.
We were the example, and they didn't like the example.
I understand. But of course, there were plenty of Christians in Lebanon, at least, and Jordan has a Christian population too.
Yes, there was a Christian population, and that Christian population is very important. I don't know, maybe we will come to that later, but I would really like for people to know that the Christian population, it's a very bad thing for the whole Middle East to lose its Christians if they should lose their Christian population. It's a very bad thing. King Hussein of Jordan said in one of the first books that he wrote, which is called Uneasy Lies the Head. He wrote it when he was very young. He said the Christians are the glue of the Middle East. Mm-hmm. And if anything should cause them to leave, we moderate Muslims would not be far behind.
Wow. Wow. I want to hopefully get back to that. I have a feeling if we talk about it now, we won't even get to your book because it's such a humongous topic. So I want to give our listeners some ideas about your book, and I want them to get a sense of your writing. So I'll ask you to read a little bit from your book. But first, can you talk about the title, In Borrowed Houses? Can you talk? It's obviously, it has a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning, and it has so many layers. So why don't you talk about that a little bit first?
Okay. You're right. It has many different meanings. For one thing, it is true that missionaries tend to borrow one another's houses a lot because
Mhm.
we go home to America for short furloughs and because a lot of people have to move or something, and we're always occupying somebody else's house while they're away. And in fact, in Lebanon, after the war started, it was not a good idea for a house to just stand empty with nobody in it because someone might take it from you because there were so many people who needed houses. And in
Mhm.
fact, that happened to us when we were trying to remodel our house before we got it finished and we were able to move in. We made a trip to the States, and while we were away, somebody occupied our house.
Mhm.
And we had a very hard time getting our house back, and it was just a huge inconvenience. But I have seen missionaries, I have seen refugees. Interesting that I thought refugee instead of missionary, isn't it? We were all
Yeah,
sort of the we were all aliens in a sense. But
absolutely
the
connections.
refugees from southern Lebanon or refugees from Palestine, I've seen them knocking down doors of houses where no one seemed to be at home because they needed shelter for their families. People needed roofs over their heads and would take it wherever they could get it. But I had a dream.
Mhm.
Really, it happened. The dream came quite a long time before the period of time that my book is about. Um,
Mm.
in my dream, I was walking on the beach. It was foggy. It was a very mysterious kind of a hazy dream. But there was a beautiful old Lebanese house there on the beach. And then appeared in front of me a young couple strolling along. And we began to talk with one another. And they told me that was their house. And they invited me to come and bring my family and have a vacation on the beach in their house. They
Mhm.
said it would make them happy to do that. And so then, in another part of my dream, we're in this house. We're there.
Mhm.
And one of my children, she was just a little girl in my dream, she opened the door and said, "Mother, there's a dead man in this room." And
Mhm.
I went and saw him myself. And I said to her, "Just close the door. It's not our business. He was here when we came. Just close the door."
Mhm.
And then I woke up horrified that I had said this. And I puzzled for a very long time about the meaning of this dream. And I tell the dream in my
Mhm.
book. And I
Mhm.
think it was part of um, I realized in the end that Lebanon itself was a borrowed home. Um, they had welcomed me like that lovely couple on the beach had made me feel welcome in their house. And then I got there and there's something wrong in the house. Something is not right here. And in a sense, it wasn't my business, but in another sense, it was my business because
Mhm.
I'm a Christian, and whatever is wrong is somehow um, part of what we have to deal with in the name of Jesus.
Yes, definitely. As you were talking about it, I was just visualizing the beach and the house and the lovely couple, and it all sounded so beautiful until of course you came to the dead man in the bedroom, and it just reminded me of a poem by Rilke, Rainer Maria Rilke. Do you ever read him?
I do know his work.
Yeah, and at one point in one of his poems, he says he's talking about what God says to us at the beginning of our lives and what God continually whispers to us throughout our lives, And at some point, God says, let everything happen to you, beauty and terror. And just the intermingling of beauty and terror reminded me of that. And the point of the poem, of course, is that God is with us through it all. And God wants us to experience the fullness.
Right.
And I got so much of just the fullness of life from your story because, I mean, it was very intense in different ways. In a terrifying way when you talked about the explosions, and in a very beautiful way when you talked about just the goodness of people. You want to talk a little bit about the house itself, the house that Wayne built?
There's a section called The House That Wayne Found, and I explained that we are still living in our friend's house because we can't get into our own house. And I said we had stored our possessions in a big room that was in our office space, and I needed that space to do the work of the publishing house, and I couldn't get out of the way so that we could use the room as it was intended. So I said at the office we had materials ready to run on our new press, but we couldn't set up the printer because of our personal possessions in the workroom, and we couldn't move them into our house. The situation made a house that Jack built kind of story. This is the house that Wayne found. This is the goat that lives in the house that Wayne found. This is Hashem, who owns the goat and took the house that Wayne found. This is the man who will lay a floor when, and I didn't go on from there, but it was a long story like this. So many ifs and so many whens, you know. But actually, the house was 150 years old. It was built of big stones, and it was built on a very steep hill and sitting right on the edge of the cliff. And the front wall was buckling so that it looked like it might topple off of the cliff. And it had been over and when it was obviously not occupied by human beings, it had been taken over, and a room had been added to, which was a place for cows. There was a place for, I think, 12 cows in this big room that was added onto this lovely stone structure that was like basically 3 rooms. It was one downstairs. One room was divided from the other by a big Arab arch, a beautiful arch, and then there was an upstairs room. Well, the point is that my husband found this place. We were having a hard time finding a place to live. We were coming home, and then when we came back, we had to have another place to live. And my husband saw all sorts of possibilities in this house. I saw nothing. To me, it was a heap of rocks, and it was going to fall off the hill, and it had a terrible smell, and the floors were earth, and the ceilings were little beams of wood crisscrossed together. It was just an impossible place to live. I thought Wayne Fuller has lost his mind. He thinks I'm going to live here. In the end, to make a long story short, my husband turned it into a house that everybody wished they had. We cleaned it up. We put white marble floors. Because
that sounds beautiful.
Marble is cheap in the Middle East, and wood is very expensive. So that's why we put, and it was amazing what happened when you put white marble floors with those beautiful old stone walls. It was really very, very beautiful. And we really were able to live in the house only a short time because it took us so long to get into it, and then because of the circumstances that forced us to leave Lebanon. But Wayne made it really a beautiful house. I'm sure I had the most beautiful kitchen in Lebanon,
Wow.
and it was, and the house became a haven and a shelter because it actually was a good, even though it was scary, the location was scary, and I mean, every place in Lebanon was scary by turn. And, but that house was safer than most houses during during an artillery attack because it was basically made of these huge stones. That wasn't true of the added room, which became my kitchen, my dining room, my office, a pantry, a little bathroom. We did a lot of things with that big room. But my husband, that kind of a genius, he could look at the thing and see all of these possibilities that most people couldn't see.
Well, yeah, I actually highlighted that where you wrote about it in the book because it just struck me. You write that Wayne liked taking something broken and fixing it, something no one else wanted, and making it valuable. And I highlighted that because it just struck me as Christ-like, picking up the broken pieces and turning it into something beautiful. Would you like to read your favorite part of the story?
It is difficult to choose a favorite portion. Actually, I think my favorite story in the book is my story about going to the refugee camp to visit Naim. You know, there was a massacre after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon. They were in charge of security around the refugee camp. But militia came into the refugee camp. This was after the Palestinian men had all been forced to leave. And so most of the population there was old men, a few younger men who didn't fight and could prove that, and women and children. And this militia group went in and spent an entire day killing people. It was a terrible massacre. And after that, there was a young man, his name is John Bushible. John is from the capital city of that, the home of that militia group and its founder. But he went down to the refugee camp and he took tea and cookies so that if anybody invited him in, he would have brought the refreshments. And the people would invite him in, and he would say, I am Christian from Victoria, and I have come to hear your story. And the people told him the whole story. Then John wanted me to go and to meet with this particular woman who is called Naim. And I had a visit with her in which she told me the story. And as you know, it's hard to read, a little bit hard to read the story because I have to stop here and there to explain things. But she came in her story up to telling about leaving Palestine when they were forced to leave, how they found a place in Lebanon, began to live in the refugee camp. She had raised a family in the refugee camp. And then she started talking about the troubles, the war with Israel, the war with Lebanon. And she said life got very hard then. We couldn't go out to work. We were hungry. Sometimes we had no water. And we were afraid, always afraid. We would hear the guns and everybody would run helter-skelter to the shelters. I knew about their underground shelters, little tunnels bored through the rocky ground. In 1976, under the rubble of Tel Azakter, which was another refugee camp that had been destroyed, I had entered one of those, a dark, smelly, gravelly place like the burrow of an animal, too small even for young children to stand up in, just large enough for adults to crawl into, one person behind the other, and go out in the opposite order. I had become panicky without any bombs falling because my back was bent and I was afraid to touch the ground in that intense darkness.
Mm.
Knowing that the existence of these tunnels had caused the Lebanese to be afraid of the Palestinians because they said they were preparing to do something terrible because they built these tunnels. So I had long wanted to ask the Palestinians, why did you build the tunnels? So I said to Naim, when did you build these tunnels? And she said, long ago. She sat on the couch, her body twisted toward me, and she kept pushing her white scarf down closer to her face, and it kept creeping back, exposing curly gray hair. I said, before the first problems in 1973? Yes, before that. Why? Because we were afraid of whom? Why? Of everybody, because nothing is ours. She turned more sharply and struck the whitewashed wall with her strong hand, thumping it again and again as she said, look, this is my house. We built this house with our hands. We bought the stones we put in it. But the land under this house, she just motioned, the land is not ours. We built our house on someone else's land because we had no choice, no place to go. She stared at me, and I stared at her. We always knew, she said, someone could come and say, go. She made a shooing motion with her hand. It happened to us in Palestine, where we had a right. For sure it would happen in another country where we had no right. Without writing this down, I would never forget it. I had often explained this simple principle to Americans when talking about refugees or the homeless, that people take up space, that a place to be is fundamental to life on earth. Without a home, people go crazy. They do self-destructive things. They become everybody's enemy. I asked Naim then, what did you do down there in the tunnel while the bombs were falling? I had wondered about this when the planes were diving on Shatila and Safra. Without a moment's hesitation, she said, I prayed. The men were outside defending us. I could hear the planes attacking. I could hear the guns shooting at them. So I asked God to keep my son for me and some Jewish mother's son for her. That you can tell by my voice, that moves me still, because this is a Christian prayer. This is a Muslim woman praying for her enemies.
Absolutely. That's amazing. That's amazing.
I don't think, Lindsay, that in all the years of the Iraq War that I heard in church somebody pray for God to protect the Iraqis.
Yeah. Yeah.
But she realized that if she was going to pray for her son to get through the battle safely, that there was a Jewish mother who wanted the same thing for her son, who was up there in the airplane bombing
Right. Yeah. That's
So I just think it's so amazing.
mm,
And I really wish that everybody, I wish that you and everybody I know could go and sit in Naeem's house with her for a few hours. It would
mm.
change the world.
I think it would. I really do think it would. That's why I want people to read your story, and because reading it is powerful and is powerful in itself. And how much more powerful would it be for if everyone could experience that that kind of humanity and that kind of love in unexpected places. Yeah, it's amazing. The Lebanese were afraid of the tunnels, and the Palestinians dug the tunnels because they were afraid. And of course, when I was reading your book, the attack of Gaza was going on over the summer, and it was the same issue. There was the same issue of tunnels, and everybody, people were justifying some of the violence because of tunnels. And I know that some tunnels may have smuggled in weapons, and others just brought in food and basic necessities or provided a shelter for people who were afraid to be above ground. And so much is done out of fear, and that really, when we think about why wars happen, we tend to think of the big politics of it. But I wonder what would change if we all just remembered that we're human beings, weak, fragile human beings, with fears and dreams and loves. If we just could remember that, I really think that there would be more peace in this world. And that's why I think your book is such a contribution to peace, because you tell such real human stories, and I think we have to keep on remembering each other's humanity. That was something that I really, really loved about your story. I want to read a section now that I found a little happier. Although what you said actually brings me so much happiness. It made you cry, but the section you read, I think, is the ultimate hope for the world, because Naeem remembered the humanity of the people bombing her, and maybe there was a Jewish mother praying for her and her son somewhere too. Maybe. So that's what gives me, that thought gives me more hope than anything else. But there's another passage that I want to read that I think parallels this one in a way. This is from a section you wrote entitled "Rejoice with Those Who Rejoice," and you're talking about your son Tim coming for a visit, and you had to give him an all clear before it was safe for him to come, because the war, as you said, was off and on, and sometimes there would be periods of peace long enough, but you never knew when they would happen. So you had to tell him when it was safe. And when it was finally safe for him to arrive, you went to pick him up at the airport, and you wrote this. No one but passengers could enter the airport building. For years it had been like that. People who came to meet travelers had to stand outside behind a flimsy movable barrier, its integrity supported by an armed guard. At either end of this barrier was space for arriving passengers to walk around it. That day I stood, wary, observant, my eyes roaming, among these expectant people. Beside me, a Muslim woman in black clothes, a tiny woman, glanced up at me now and then. She couldn't have been 5 feet tall. I spoke to her and she smiled and said, Ahlan. She had a dry, shriveled face and small, alert eyes. Travelers came out the door, 1 or 2 at a time, carrying suitcases and walking toward us. Some of them found family or friends and got kissed on both cheeks. Others whizzed off in taxis. Then a small river of people came out, none of them Tim. The time grew long, the crowd at the rail sparse. The Muslim woman remained. She watched me and the door. Finally, there he was, skinny and erect, fair and obvious, with his flaming hair and red beard, his hands free, a pack on his back. I forgot to be unobtrusive and clapped my hands together and laughed, and beside me the Muslim lady jumped and clapped her hands and laughed and looked from me to Tim and back, beaming. From this I knew she was the mother. I still loved her for being happy with me. And I just love that story, partly because I have seen pictures of you, and I may have seen pictures of him. For everyone listening, I know Francis's daughter, Jan. That's how I knew about Francis's book in the first place. And I know that this family is a family of tall, light-skinned people, and the physical contrast in my mind was just very stark. You looked very foreign, very different from that woman. There couldn't have been a sharper contrast. And she's just so excited for these two people who look so different, who are obviously from somewhere else, and she's just so excited for your reunion. I can just imagine both of you towering over everyone, and her just looking up at you, straining her neck to look up and laughing and clapping. And it was just such a beautiful image because you were obviously very different, but you were connected by love and probably motherhood too. She probably just understood all of your joy intuitively then, and I love that. Earlier you were talking about Naeem's story when she said the Lebanese were afraid of them and they were afraid of the Lebanese, and I was thinking of the Palestinians and the Lebanese being afraid of each other, and I was thinking about how fear spreads like contagion and just infects people in the worst ways, but joy spreads like that too. Joy can be catching. I think we have to focus on how to spread joy and not be held back by fear. So I wanted to read that part because it just struck me as such a beautiful example of positive mimesis here with our Raven lingo. So I wanted to read that part for that reason. You're there in Lebanon as a missionary, so you're obviously reading scripture and praying a lot. And I was wondering if there were any particular passages of scripture or hymns or prayers you turn to. I was wondering if the context of living in an unstable and not particularly safe country made any of the scripture passages different. Or if
yes, I think there are a lot of things in the Bible that never had meaning to me. For instance, there's a lot of times especially in the Old Testament and in the Psalms, when somebody talks about enemies. And I didn't know how it felt to have an enemy. Frankly, I didn't have anybody I thought I could think of as an enemy. And so I paid more attention to those passages. But you know, one of the outstanding verses to me are little tidbits that came alive for me was I believe it's Psalm 36:11. It says, in the translation I was reading at the time, it says, "Let not the foot of arrogance come upon me, or the hand of the wicked drive me away." I think I just read over that a jillion times. But when I was in Lebanon, well, what I want to explain to you is that one of the things we observed was how guns made people arrogant. It made them behave arrogantly. The war was mostly being fought by young men. And they would get together, I mean, like 6 of them in a station wagon and drive through the street of the windows and just drive through the street and disobey all the rules and make a lot of noise and call attention to themselves. For what? To make us know they're there, and they were somehow cocky, and that sometimes they would ride on little trucks and have a machine gun mounted on the bed of the truck, or an anti-aircraft gun. And they would do the same things, ride through the streets, scaring everybody to death, and maybe they're trying to say, look, we're in control here, so there were so many pictures of arrogance. And so when I read that, "Please don't let that arrogant foot step on me," that was painful in a way that I never had thought of it before, And then the other part of it, or the hand of the wicked drive me away. The reason that was so meaningful is that there was always, for years and years and years, there was pressure on us to leave Lebanon. The American Embassy advised us over and over to leave Lebanon. We did not want to leave Lebanon. Local people sometimes said, if I had another place to go, I wouldn't be here. There was, and from America, we would get letters saying, "Why don't you get out of there?" I mean, my own mother kept trying to get me to leave Lebanon, And I didn't want to leave Lebanon for the wrong reason. If I ever left, I wanted it to be because God wanted me to leave. Not because I was afraid. Not because arrogant men were running around with guns and it wasn't safe. Not because there was some evil power that wasn't work and wanted me gone. If I left, I wanted it to be for a good reason, for a right reason. Not that kind of a reason. And so really I prayed that prayer many a time. Don't let, for us it was like, I don't want to get shot here. I really don't want to get shot. And then, but I don't want to run away either, So badly, we did not want to get scared and run.
Wow. I can't even imagine. I mean, I cannot even imagine living in a land of war. Of course, I haven't lived anywhere where there has been a war going on. I mean, America has not had a war on its own soil since really since the 1800s. So even though we fight wars continuously, it's not something that I have ever experienced. But I do have a best friend living in Iraq now, and I pray for her constantly, and I want her to leave Iraq. I want her sister to leave Afghanistan sometime. But they don't want to. They want to live in their home with their families, and they're safe enough. They say so. But I just can't imagine. But you loved people who couldn't leave. You loved people for whom Lebanon was their home, and you wanted to stay with them.
Right.
Yeah, and that's I can imagine that if I were in that situation, I could probably have the same kind of courage or the same kind of desire for courage, but I don't. It's so hard to even imagine.
I think in the situation, you would find the resources. You haven't needed them, so you didn't find them.
Right.
But you would.
Yeah. You described in the book that everyday decisions that we all make that the war makes harder, like you had to make decisions about what street you would walk down and whether or not you would go out and whether or not you would cross a road, and the book explains a lot of that. And one part that just really got to me was when you and your husband Wayne decided to take separate cars home because I guess the fighting was particularly intense, and you didn't want to be in the same car if something should happen. That just, that's hard to imagine anyone going through and having to make those kinds of decisions. I don't even know what to say about that except to talk about it now so that readers could see that you went through things like that. These are all things that we don't think about when we wage war in countries half a world away. So, yeah.
Yes, it's tough on the ground. It's tough on the ground where the action is, and civilians are just caught in it, and they have to try to go on living. They have to go out and get food.
Mm-hmm.
They have to find ways to, if they don't work, they don't get any money. If they don't get any money, they can't buy food. So life becomes just a struggle of how to keep your life together. How to function. And for us, frankly, one thing that I always did say, I said, if I can't do my work, then I don't have an excuse to be here. I thought if I had to just sit in my house, what good was I? I was a publisher after all. I was publishing Christian books, and it was a very, very important ministry, and people all over the Arab world were depending on books that were being done in Lebanon, and at what years, before my story actually began, I went on a tour of the Middle East and Europe to find another place for the publishing house, because the board of directors wanted me to go to find a better place for Baptist publications. And I went to 7 cities in 5 countries in Europe and the Middle East. And as I traveled, I thought, and I realized that the reason why I'm in Lebanon in the first place is that the things I need are not anywhere else, but especially the strong Christian community that I had in Lebanon. I had a source of editors and writers and secretaries and all of the things. I had print shops and all of the facilities, all the technology, everything that I needed in Lebanon. But most of all were the people. The people who made up my staff. And as I thought about all of that, I basically decided that I had to function in Lebanon, that Lebanon was the place for the publishing house. That's where I had to be. And I came back and I wrote a very big report, and the bottom line was I'd rather be in Lebanon with shells falling. And maybe I said that a little bit flippantly because I didn't know the war would last 15 years when I said that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but I had to make it work. So that's why I was at work on a day when maybe I should not have been at work. And Wayne and I went home. We didn't have to, but we thought the course of wisdom was to go home in separate cars. So if the worst happened, it was not likely to happen to both of us, you know. And I mean, we were thinking of our children. We just didn't want to leave our children orphans. And but that was the only time that we had to do that. But I realized, and I realized then too at times that my work was greater than running the publishing house, that we did have a role in encouraging people, supporting people, loving people.
Yeah.
Something happened one time that's not in my book, but there was a militiaman whom I really didn't know. I couldn't write about this person because I didn't really know him, but for some reason I met him, and it was at a point in which the American Embassy was trying to get all of us Americans to leave if I was leaving. And instead of telling him, I would pick his brain. So I said, "What do you think I should do?" And he thought about it for a little bit, and then he said, "Don't go." And I said, "Well, you know, why should I stay here and risk my life? I'm just trying. I'm playing devil's advocate, you know." And he said, "Because the war won't last forever.
Yeah.
And we're going to need someone to teach us how to love again."
Wow. Wow.
I didn't ever see that young man again. He offered to put a guard on my door. I said, "Oh no, please don't put a guard on my door. That's not going to help me." But he sincerely didn't want us to leave. He didn't really know me very well. He knew about me. But somehow he had a spiritual understanding of what their problem was, you know?
Yeah.
We've stopped loving each other.
That's, wow. Wow. The work you do there, you know, it was more than the publishing, because the relationships you made that you wrote about have touched my life, and they've touched the lives of all of your readers. I was thinking when you were talking earlier about how you came back from furlough and your house was occupied and you experienced the frustration of having a house that you couldn't live in. You talked about how all this stuff was there and you couldn't get your work done. But in the book, you write about that, and you write about how that whole experience gave you some empathy for all of the refugees that you were living amongst. Right. And you have a beautiful section that goes beyond the refugees of Palestine to you know, people who have had their houses seized unjustly throughout history. And I just thought, you know, you're not getting any of the work done that you came to do, but you were growing as a person in ways that, you know, I hope I never have my house seized. I hope I never have to learn empathy that way. But the point is, every day that you lived in Lebanon, you were obviously learning and growing so much. And I think God uses that in ways that we can't even imagine. And so,
and that's one thing that makes every experience important and valuable. As long as we learn something, it was worth it.
Hmm. And just the way you wrote in so much beautiful detail, I could tell that, you were obviously an observer and a listener. And so, I know there's so much that's not in the book, every day of your life for 30 years and, 7 covered in this book. I imagine you were giving people so much love because you write as if you're a person who is really, really present with others. And so I know that God has used you in such wonderful ways, Frances, and that, that's why I feel so honored to talk to you tonight. So
Thank you.
I had one more question to tie the events of your book back to today. And you write in your section, Affirmation and Warning, you wrote about a visit to Dr. Charles Malik, who was a professor, and he said, he actually said Christianity was facing extinction in the Middle East, and we worry about the Christian population in the Middle East today. So do you see signs of hope? I don't know how to make that a nice question. It's a terrible situation that's going on now, and I don't know how to word it in a positive way. But
Well, when Dr. Malik said that Christianity would become extinct in the Middle East, I was stunned and horrified that he had said it. I didn't believe it. I had to respect Dr. Malik because he knew a lot that I didn't know about so many things, and I'm sure that he had very good reasons for saying that. I don't know if he could have predicted something like what has happened now. Maybe he did. He didn't. We didn't get to those details, and I don't know everything he was thinking. But I never imagined something like people cutting off the heads of Christians or killing them because they wouldn't convert on the spot to Islam. I never imagined that at the time. What I thought he meant was that, kind of gradually the church, for one reason or another, would be weakened by people immigrating to America, because that's something that always happened. America is such a magnet for the people of the world. They feel if you can't make it financially where you are, if you go to America, you're going to be rich like all those people. They see American and they think we have everything, and I think they're often disappointed when they get to Detroit, But that's what I thought. I thought it was something slow like that, and then the truth of the matter is, there's been a terrible loss for Christianity in the last, say, 15 years or less. Because we Americans didn't. I have to believe that we didn't know what we were doing in the Middle East all of these years. The government that held together the societies and made it safe for Christians were the secular governments, and the secular governments were all dictatorships in a way. Assad is a tyrant. Hussein was a tyrant. Even the president of Egypt was a tyrant. But when those people fell, the security of the Christians went away. Why is that? The reason is partly that there is this, it's because the Middle East hasn't learned how to live with their diversity. Lebanon is the most diverse country in the Middle East, and has done an amazing thing to stay together as long as it has, and is not a dictatorship, you see. But the other countries, Assad, for instance, he was from a minority group himself, and he protected the Christians and gave the Christians freedom. Hussein would not let any group of people in the country get the power over another group because he wanted the power. Everybody wants the power. That's the problem. They don't know how to share in a pluralistic society. So the Sunnis want power, the Shias want power, the Christians want power. Every little people group wants power, and so the dictator held it together. And same fell, the Christians were attacked. And the Christians fled by the thousands from Iraq, without ISIS doing anything. But I mean, in a sense, ISIS is just the extreme end of something that was already happening. I read an article just recently by someone who had gone to Turkey and to the places where the Christians that ISIS expelled from their villages. They ran from those villages. The survivors of all of that chaos say that they will not consider going back. They say, we have been persecuted ever since Saddam fell. This is just the last straw. It's not the whole thing. So really, it looks very bad for Christians right now, and the war, the conflict in the Middle East now is basically between Muslims. It's not really. It's not really Muslims against Christians, and by participating in the war, we make it seem more that it might be against Christians. And everything is driven by fear. In Lebanon, we saw that so vividly. Everybody afraid of everybody. The Christians are afraid of the Muslims are afraid of the Christians, the Sunnis are afraid of the Shias are afraid of the Sunnis, the Armenians are afraid of everybody, the Kurds, everybody is afraid of somebody. And even little school children, a little child came to school, to our Baptist school in Beirut, came weeping in the morning and told Mrs. Ragland, who was the principal's wife, she said, "What's the matter, honey?" Because the child is crying. And the little boy said, "The Christians are going to kill us." He had heard that at home or somewhere, and he came to school weeping. And she said, "Well, honey, I'm a Christian, and I love you." And he said, "You're a Christian? Oh." And that gave him a new picture of, he suddenly felt safe, But even the little children, they're already afraid.
Yeah.
Well, we saw over and over and over that it's all driven by fear.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because they somehow every group wants power, and Lebanon is especially fragile. I had an email last week from a friend in Beirut, which said nothing except this: security is frail, and there's fire under the ashes. I took it as, pray for us. You actually Very good question. You asked me if I saw any hope, and I didn't give you hope.
Well, but no, you did. You did because you showed love to the people and you saw their needs and you helped them. You just worked tirelessly to help the people who needed it. There are a lot of stories like that in your book. And what the world needs is more incarnational witnesses like you and Wayne and your children. What the world needs is people who demonstrate that very active compassion that you talked about, people who take being the body of Christ as seriously as you do. And so people like you give me hope, Francis. You give me hope because you give me that kind of model that we all need.
Well, I hope my book makes a contribution by giving the reader giving the Middle Easterner a human face for the reader. When you read about Naim and Maria and Michelle and all of these people in my story, I think you will love them too. I think other people will love them too.
Mm-hmm. Well, I do love them. And I love you, Francis. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing with us today.
Thank you. It was fun talking with you.
It was fun.
Bye-bye.
You too. Goodbye.